Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. My special guest today is Frank Anderson, a former student of mine who now teaches at a public school in Brooklyn. Specifically, he teaches emotionally and mentally challenged children. Frank is also an artist. Indeed, he has a master's degree in fine arts from Rutgers University. Frank, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Frank, how long have you been teaching special children, and what age group do you teach?
Well, I've been teaching about 17 years, and I've been teaching elementary school, which is, the ages from about 5 to about 12. And this year I'm teaching music, so I go from room to room. So I might have 5-year-olds, and then I might move to a class with 11-year-olds, so I go back and forth all day long.
What specific problems do your students have?
Well, I've been working this year with students who have what may be categorized as symptoms of autism, and other students who may be categorized with symptoms of MR with emotional disability.
Yeah. If one were to open the door to a classroom in which you teach, what would they see? How would the classroom be different from the typical classroom at a public school in New York City?
Well, they're trying to bridge the gap so that they're trying to make all school education pretty much similar so that no child is somehow not treated the same. So the way that special ed seems to be different, especially in a specialized special ed program like mine where all the students are special ed, they try to work on the process more. The process, since they are alternately assessed, is different. They have to be worked in a more gradual way.
Are there desks in your classroom? And what kind of desks are they? Are there tables, desks? What's the arrangement?
Yeah, the desks are very important. Like I say, the process is very important, so the structure of the room is very important. It's kind of like when you're going to a kindergarten class, you have structure is very important. It's not like all the rows. Like when we went to school, everybody could be assigned in a logical row and order.
Yeah, not in your classrooms.
No, we may use groupings more so, and structures, sort of like in kindergarten where you have groupings of students where they can then access things in a more useful way rather than just a structured way.
Some of your students are in wheelchairs.
No, not in this school, no.
Uh-huh. So that all of the children in your classes can walk by themselves.
That's right.
And again, they're not sitting at traditional desks, but tables. Is that fair to say? You describe them as tables? Is that what they're sitting at?
Yeah, there's the MR with emotional component. Students tend to have a more traditional seating pattern, but everything is in flux. They will push for structure depending on the process that is being used.
How many children in a typical classroom?
Well, the classes are either 6 to 1 to 1, which means 6 students with a para and a teacher, or they're 8 to 1 to 1, which is 8 students, or they're like 12 to 1. Usually, with the autism and the MR, it's usually either 6 to 1 to 1 or 8 to 1 to 1.
And almost all the students you teach are between the ages of 5 and 7. Is that correct?
The students I teach this year, since I'm in music, I go from the whole gamut, so I go from kindergarten up to 11, yeah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned some of the children are autistic. You use the term, I think, MR. What does that...
Right, well, that was the older term. They changed the terms because the labels are, as you know,
in the
labels...
old days, it would be mentally retarded.
Right.
Is that what people...
Labels are not really justify any... And nobody really fits into a label. They're just used by doctors and teachers to help categorize people so that they think they can work with them better that way.
Right.
But they're really not helpful for the students to have a label, and usually labels are very inadequate in addressing what the student is about.
Okay, because people can be mentally retarded in different ways, is that correct? And to very different degrees?
Exactly, and they may be they may not be MR in other ways. It's not like across the board.
Isn't it true some mentally retarded people, if I can use that term, are savants in some ways, that some have extraordinary intelligence in certain areas?
Exactly, especially autism tends to be categorized by having high and low abilities, where you have very good at some things and not so good at other things. MR is usually a little more across the board even, but even those things are just labels that nobody really fits into a label anyway.
Okay.
But it tends to be that autism goes up and down in abilities, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Howard Gardner teaches psychology and education at Harvard, and he believes we misuse the word intelligence. He says there are so many ways to be intelligent. He's reluctant to say somebody's more intelligent than another, and he's distinguished at least 7 major ways in which people can be intelligent. And he says that school generally, regular schools, so to speak, only generally measure 2 areas of intelligence, verbal and mathematical. But again, he goes on to point out that people can have an emotional intelligence, in that they have greater intelligence about understanding themselves than other people. Psychological intelligence, social intelligence. In fact,
That's true.
One of his students, Daniel Goleman, has a book out now called Social Intelligence.
Well,
I know that some of your students are autistic. About what percentage of the children you teach are autistic? And what is autism? You know, my guess is many of the people watching have heard the term autism, but may have little or no understanding of what it's all about. So again, first of all, what percentage of your kids are autistic?
Well, in the current setup in the school that I'm at right now, about 50% of the ones I see are autistic, and 50% are that other category of disability that I was mentioning before.
And what is autism?
Autism is kind of a symptomatic. The symptoms that you would see are more like high level of functioning in some areas and low in others, where they might be very good at like programming a radio and a CD player, but not be able to wash their hands or something. They may be really good at finding music on the radio.
Yeah.
And sing and everything, but then just not be able to brush their teeth or whatever, whatever it is, just very high and low.
Yeah.
That tends to be what it looks like.
Some autistic children can talk, as I understand it, and some cannot. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Some can talk. Generally, they have the other general, besides high and low ability, they usually have a little trouble communicating with themselves or with others, like about what's actually happening.
Yeah. Now, those autistic children who can't speak, there's nothing wrong with their vocal cords or with any part of the apparatus which allows them to speak. It's psychological. Is that what's thought? It's
generally
a psychological
yeah,
problem
I think
as to why they
most
can't
likely. I'm not a doctor. I'm not to say, but
yeah,
probably. It's more of a psychological thing. But how the affection, usually they aren't as engaging. I mean, in the typical ways that is engaging. So that natural language is a part of engagement, and they don't always use that.
So they may not smile, for example, when it's appropriate to smile.
Right.
Might not laugh when it might be appropriate to laugh.
Yeah, some of the emotions might appear different other than the average. And it's basically a little bit of a fear of sometimes they don't like to be touched. It's general though. I can't say for all. They're all each one is as unique as anyone else. Some don't like to be touched, or which is good. But I mean,
this is interesting. You mentioned touching. I remember seeing a teacher on the television program 60 Minutes years ago, a very successful female teacher, a black woman in Chicago, who had taught in the public schools for many years and got sick and tired of the inefficiency of the public schools and started her own school. I think her name was Marva Collins. I apologize if I got it wrong, but I was so impressed by her. And they showed her teaching for about 30 minutes or so. And one of the things she often did, and her students, I'm guessing, range from 12 to 15, something like that. She often touched the kids in a very affectionate way, the boys and the girls.
Yeah, you have to watch that in school. You really can't touch the kids. But I'm just saying that, in general, they seem to not.
She had a private school. She was doing this in a private
you're not allowed
school.
to touch it in schools. But it's just that there's a feeling like they don't really want to connect. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if psychologists and psychiatrists believe that touching these kids in an affectionate way, in an appropriate way, would be helpful.
Well, there are OT. A lot of them have OT teachers and occupational therapists who come in and do some activities, physical activities. I'm not trained in that, but they do have some physical activities which bring them out of themselves too.
Yeah.
The OTs and there's a lot of therapists who come into the room also.
Because my point is, I can understand the Board of Education having rules saying, in general, they don't want teachers touching kids because that can lead to dangerous situations.
Well, as we know, yeah.
But on the other hand, I think it's fair to say that the right teacher touching children in the right way,
they need probably a therapist. They
therapeutic.
probably could do need a therapist. Teachers aren't doing therapy, but we can try to address emotional things in other ways, with activities, whether it be art. Art is a good way to connect,
Yeah. What do you try to teach these children when you're teaching autistic children, 5, 6, 7 years old? When you're teaching children who are mentally challenged, if I can use that term, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish with them?
Well, the standards are changing all the time. Special ed is relatively new. It's only been around since the way it is now since 1974, when they passed Public Law 94-142, which said that everyone should have an education the same as, you know. So that's only 30 years of work. So it's always in flux. But right now, they're the same standards as everyone else, pretty much.
Yeah.
You know, we just have to achieve them in different ways.
Do you teach them arithmetic?
Right. We have math, science, English, you know, language. We have social studies. Just the same standards as everyone else that we're trying to reach.
What methods do you use? I would assume, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you are teaching these children and you talk too much, for example, and this is probably bad for any teacher, but if you're going to lose them, that do you ask questions regularly, or exactly what do you do? What are the methods that you employ to teach these children?
Yeah, the main thing that's used is, like I said before, a lot of schedules where you have, they're using communication devices and universal symbols, Mayor Johnson symbols they used, and they're universal symbols so that they can communicate all day long and to sequence things all day. The same thing is learning, I guess reading is really a sequencing, really.
You teach reading, among other things, do you?
Right, right. So basic thing we try to teach is reading and math. Those are the two basic categories that we started with. But you know, we try to fit in social studies, science, but all of them come through reading and math. So that's the big focus in special ed, is reading. Because if they can sequence things, that's the beginning of reading. So they use symbols to sequence from one side to the other, left to right, just like when we read. And then gradually those symbols become words because the symbols incorporate a word, and then eventually they only need the word.
The attention span of most children, I guess, is short. With these children, it's especially short. Is that a fair statement to make?
Yeah, generally they need to be just like all younger children. Like you want to keep people interested. Nowadays, all children have all this technology, so that years ago they might be interested in something that was a little more uninteresting, for lack of a better word, and they need lights and cameras. They might need, kids with technology, they're playing video games all day. There's more involving, so all students need something to keep them hooked. And the same with them, they need to be hooked with.
Now you mentioned you have a para in the room, perhaps 6 children, perhaps 6 with a para.
Yeah.
And is it fair to say you're not going to talk too much at any one time? You may give a few instructions, and then will you go to each child, and will the para assist you maybe with another child?
Right.
Is this pretty much the way it's done?
That's
See,
right.
it's not so much standing in front of the room
Exactly.
and talking a lot. You're not going to
Trying
do that.
trying to move them into an individualized learning experience. Yeah. Especially there are some programs that we use designed to have the students to learn to work individually. To help to actually create something without any help.
Do they have a workbook? Does each child have a workbook?
They do have workbooks, and it's pretty much depending on the level of the student, But generally, I like to create my own books because I use some of my art background, and I use computers to make up books based on traditional books that they already know. And then we use photographs to help sequence the book.
So you make up a lot of your own materials.
Right,
you
right.
Make up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to make up my own books pretty much because each student is so unique. They can't just say, "Oh, let's go read Charles Dickens." It wouldn't relate to them. They have to. Each student needs a different kind of book.
And I mentioned early on in the program you have a master's degree in fine arts from Rutgers. How do you use art? How do you incorporate art into your teaching? Of what value? I guess that's really what I'm asking.
That's
of what value
that's a
is
good
your art
lead-in for that.
background in doing this?
That's true. That's what I was about to say. That the art helps to relate the book to them. First of all, visual art, is really helpful because they can actually see things that they know in the real world, and then see that the book, and then if it's emulated through art, they can see, the book and the art are similar, and the art relates to something they know in the real world. So I'm able to draw the things that are in the book that relate to their life, so they can see it, and then they can actually use that drawing.
You're drawing people, you're drawing houses, what are you drawing?
Right, all those things.
All those things.
Yes, all those things. Everything a book incorporates, we bring it out. And luckily, most of the books that they read have good pictures also. So we're working with the pictures in the books, and then we bring them out in paper, and various materials or sculpture or whatever it is that helps them to get involved in the book. And then we also use, we also may act out the book, which is kind of a theatrical aspect too. Acting out the book, using the props, or actually creating the art in the little scenarios. All these things help them to get involved in the book. And then ultimately, now this year I've been using a lot of music to help make poetry about the book too. So you're learning reading, singing, and rhyming of.
So some of the children sing in class, do
right,
they?
Right. So we sing a lot of the books, and then we learn phonics through the singing, where some of the words rhyme. I try to make them all rhyme so that they learn specific phonetical sounds, and so we're learning some reading, some symbolic reading, and we also learn how to read the whole book from beginning to end.
Now, the children who can speak will read out loud occasionally? You'll have them read out loud?
Yeah, that's right. The big thing with the singing is I'll have an experience chart on the wall, and they'll come up. I'll have one student point to the words and another student's drumming the guitar. Well, everybody has their own job. So I might play the chords, somebody else drums it, somebody points to the words, somebody's following the sequence in the on the symbolic. There's also a symbolic, you can read it on words or you can read it in symbols, so each child has his own job to do.
Now, we mentioned early on, some of the autistic children do not speak. So obviously you cannot have them read aloud. How does one know if an autistic child is learning how to read?
Yeah, the symbols are helpful because if I use the felt-board symbol chart rather than the experience chart with written words, if they can't read the words, they can always match the symbols. So I'll say, or identify the symbol. I'll say, okay, Clifford went to the big cake or whatever. So they
went to the big cake.
Right, they could find the big cake. So I know that they
They'll point to it.
Right, they know the noun or they know the verb, go. We might have to find the verb, go, or they might have to find the noun, cake.
Okay, and they'll point to it.
Right.
So then you know that they're learning.
Right. Point to it or match it. I'll rip it off. It's also on Velcro, so you give it to them and they match it on Velcro onto the felt board.
It's a fair statement, though, that teaching autistic children who don't speak to read is more difficult than teaching autistic children who speak to read?
Sure, it's a lot of materials to make. You have to make the symbols. Sometimes you can buy, there are something called Goosen's books where they're already pre-made and you can actually have all the Velcro. All the Velcro's already been cut and put on the symbols and it's been laminated and now they can just match it. But if you don't have the book that relates to your theme or the topic that you're working on that month, you have to make the book, get the laminate. So it's a lot of pre-production before the student gets the materials in their hand.
Yeah. What you do sounds to me very difficult, to tell you the truth. I think in many ways more difficult than teaching so-called regular mainstream children. Did the Board of Ed provide much help in terms of preparing you for teaching children like this?
Well, 20 years ago, a lot of these things were just coming about, so there was no way to prepare for it. Because like I say, special ed is a new thing, so it's always in flux. It's always just like education is in flux across the board, but special ed is really in flux because it's trying to keep up with the changes that are going on in regular ed. So a lot of these things weren't really established at that time when I first was in school. But they did start me off actually in graduate school with a good background in symbolic. LIU gave
Did the teachers who taught you how to teach these children, did they ever teach these children? The reason I mention that, I recall when I was in college many years ago thinking about becoming a teacher because I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a teacher or a writer or what I wanted to be, even a psychologist. But I took a course in methods of teaching social studies, and the professor admitted that she had never taught social studies, never taught high school. And I thought to myself, well, gee, I want my money back. I didn't have the boldness to say that, and I thought that the course was pretty much a waste of time. And I spent some years teaching high school, as you know, more than a few years, and I often found that people in top positions never did what I was doing, and might have been sitting in the back of the room taking notes on what I did, giving me advice, and I thought the whole thing was so phony. So again, I'm asking you, and I think in my opinion, there's a lot of phoniness in schools of education. I think some schools of education should probably be razed to the ground because some of these professors haven't taught high school and may not even want to.
Yeah, probably elementary school is
or junior high school, elementary. So again, I'm asking you, did the people who prepared you to teach these children, have they actually taught these children?
I mean, like the first education course I took was at Rutgers, and that guy who taught that class, he actually wrote this famous book on it's called the Dulce List or something of of vocabulary words for students to learn.
Yeah.
And it was helpful to know that, so when I went out and I said, oh, you guys got to learn these words first, the book incorporated everything I needed to know to teach the students. And so I think with elementary, sometimes the professors actually do have to get out in the field and actually see what does work.
Yeah.
That was sort of helpful. And then when I got to LIU, there were some teachers. The graduate program at LIU actually doesn't use professors, it uses more so, they do use professors, but the ones I had were mostly instructors who were principals in in Board of Ed schools, and they were also teaching at LIU at the same time. So they were doing two things at the same time. They were teaching in college, and they were also teaching at a public school.
They were. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the fundamental reforms university schools of education must make, and I'm editorializing now because I feel so strongly about this, no professor of education should be allowed to sit in the back of a high school classroom, middle school or elementary school classroom, taking notes on the student teacher, telling him how to improve, unless the professor gets his or her butt in front of that classroom and shows the student how to do it, the student teacher.
It's true.
When surgeons, when novices who are learning how to be medical surgeons want to learn how to be surgeons, the chief surgeon doesn't sit down and say, well, do this, do that. The chief surgeon says, watch me do it, and then you'll be able to take out somebody's appendix. And I think there's been, in my opinion, and again, you can see I feel strongly, there's been so much phoniness in education concerning...
Watch me do it is an interesting philosophy, watch me do it.
Watch
like you say, probably looking at this,
the
way that doctors do it is probably a valid way. I don't really know how doctors do it, but that's probably how they do it, where top guy learns how to do the surgery, and then the other ones watch. It's an interesting concept. I never thought of that.
Yeah. Now, do your students get report cards, I assume? If they do, tell me what do the report cards look like? And I guess my basic question is this. Do your kids take tests? And if they don't, how do you evaluate your students? That's really the question. How do you evaluate your students to see if they're making progress?
Well, the students I've been teaching for the last 17 years are something called alternate assessment, which means that they don't take the traditional tests that other students take because they're not in that category. There are special education students who are more modified, and they do take the tests.
Written tests.
They take the same tests as everyone else.
Yeah.
They'll take standardized tests, and they take them the same years as everyone else. With the alternate assessment, they do get assessed the same way, but with a different test. Like they might use something called the Brigance test, where the teacher comes over and assesses them on a whole lot of skills, from gross motor to academic, reading, math, and it's always assessed at the same time, so you see if there's progress in each of those areas. And at the same time, that same teacher has to assess students during certain years in, I think it's like the 4th grade. They're changing it, but it was the 4th grade, where in that year they have to find all the material that they've done and see how it represents their accomplishment in each of the standards, and write it up, and they have to write it up and explain how that work shows this achievement. And and they also may have to use sequence of pictures of, let's just say if a student is accomplishing a task, you may need three pictures of that particular task to show that particular aspect of that standard. So they have to use sequences of pictures in each thing if they really want to have an adequate assessment of it, or a videotape of that activity.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, some of the kids do take the regular tests, and some don't take, when I say regular, the same test mainstream kids would take. Some of your students do take.
Right.
Other students
Others don't, yeah. Others don't. And the ones that don't are usually are categorized below a level of able to, where that test would have any address to them. But the students who take the alternate assessment also have the benefit of actually seeing what they do. Rather, some students just do good on tests, and they might not really know what they're actually learning. Tests are a little bit foolproof. They're not totally foolproof. Whereas in special ed, you're actually seeing the picture of the student accomplishing it. You're seeing a videotape of them accomplishing it, or you're seeing the teacher describe how a particular works accomplished that particular standard. So in a way, it's more valid than a test.
And what does the report card look like?
Yeah, the report card will show each of the standards and how those assessments are showing, and then same as a regular report card. It'll show how he's performing in those. But the report cards go home just like everyone else.
They do.
But they have the special ed has something called an IEP, which is an individualized education plan, where each student is working on different plan. Even though it's the same standards they're working on, is a different plan. So it's individualized.
One of the things that comes through in listening to you today is that we're really still in the process. When I say we, I mean society, educators, still in the process of learning how to best teach these children. That a lot of it is experimentation, I would assume. That some things we do know for certain, but other technologies, methodologies, we're just exploring.
And also, we're also learning what works for the individual, not only in terms of learning materials, but also in terms of how what's best for them socially. We don't want to label anyone, and because labels aren't really true.
I see we're running short on time. I mentioned at the top of the program, Frank is an artist, and in running the credits today, one of the things we're going to do is to show you some of his paintings. And I want you to come back for another program where we'll talk at length about art.
Okay, thank you.
Now, as usual, I'd like to end the program in the usual way I do with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau in Walden penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."